the public's confidence in the local electoral system as being efficient, democratic and transparent. I commend this bill to the House and hope that it finds good support from all parties across the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. The Honourable Enoch King.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party will be supporting the Local Electoral Amendment Bill number 2. As we have heard, this bill amends the Local Electoral Act 2001 and the Local Electoral Regulations of 2001 to implement the government's decision on amendments to the legislation. I think it's important to point out what the purpose is. It is threefold. It will improve provisions for the conduct of local elections, increase transparency and accountability in the provisions, receipt, disclosure, recording and reporting by candidates of electoral donations, and strengthen the integrity and efficiency of local electoral systems. As a result, public confidence in local elections will increase, according to the explanation on the bill we are talking about tonight. I have also looked at the regulatory impact statement on this bill, and it says this: in the Department's view, the analysis and consultations it undertook to develop the proposal meets the adequacy standards. The analysis provides a sound basis for decisions to amend the Local Electoral Act. The proposed amendment will provide clear, consistent, robust and reasonable legislation. Well, let's be honest about what the sound basis for this bill is, mentioned but not named in the regulatory impact statement. This bill should be called the John Banks Bill, because this bill is about straightening up the behaviour of one of the National Party's ministers. You see, the Labor Party had a bill in the ballot for months to address the ridiculous situation we have seen with John Banks and his so-called anonymous donations. It was in the name of David Cunliffe. It was a bill that does just what this government bill does. It was in the name of David Cunliffe, for the member who's obviously got bad hearing, and it was set down by the Labor Party for months. For months, the government took no notice of it, mainly because it was an opposition bill. Of course, nothing the opposition ever does could be good enough for this government. So it was set down for us to be able to debate such a bill. Ignored, it was not good enough. And then, hello, we've got a government bill that is almost identical to the one that was set down by the Labor Party. And I wonder why they could not have picked up the bill that was already there, because when you have a look at the timetable from announcing that they were going to have a bill, there is a little discrepancy, because you actually see in the Parliament where the Deputy Prime Minister was asked if he would support such a bill by Grant Robertson. And Bill English said yes, well, in fact, he would. But Bill English said, yes, the government would likely support such a law. It seems to make sense that the disclosure laws for local government political donations would be similar to central government political donations. Grant Robertson then sought to table the Labor Party bill. Hello, it was turned down by the National Party, but later that day, in what the media described as a surprise announcement, the local government minister, David Carter, said work was already underway and they were making good progress on a government bill. Well, 6 weeks later, Mr Carter's announcement on the Wednesday did not include a new bill, but said it will be introduced early next month in order to enact the changes by May 2030. What it showed was, in fact, no work had been done on a bill from the time of the surprise announcement through to the time that he announced that there would be a bill later on. And to me, that wasn't quite true, honest, because announcing that work was being done and good progress was being made was in an effort to cover up what John Banks had been doing by saying the government was already on top of this issue. Well, in fact, they weren't on top of this issue. And so what we have had, I think, has been something that has been bad for this Parliament and bad for local government, and that has been the behaviour of one of our members in this House, a member who knowingly received and has been shown to knowingly receive donations and then forget that he received them. We cannot have a system where one person can bring so much odium on the rest of us because he couldn't remember if he got those donations. And then we had the Prime Minister, who the Prime Minister said, well, you know, there is a wide definition of ethics when it came to John Banks. That's a direct quote from the Prime Minister. He said there's a wide definition of ethics. Well, I'd say to Mr Key, there is one definition of ethics that ought to be applied to members in this House and particularly to Cabinet Ministers, and that is they ought to be able to remember if they receive donations. Now, these donations for John Banks came when he was standing for Mayor of Auckland. These donations he did not make transparent. He did not declare that he knew they existed, although he took a cheque from Sky City in an envelope. He instructed .com as to how they ought to pay these donations, and we had a candidate of long standing, a person who'd been a member in this House, who'd been a former Minister of Police, who was prepared to forget that he had donations. Well, that is not good enough, Mr Speaker, and we needed this legislation some time ago. And it's not appropriate for a Prime Minister to allow that sort of behaviour around the donations that came from a local government candidate to be brought into this House and bring the rest of us into disrepute, because that is exactly what has happened. And I deplore the double standards that have been applied over the years, particularly by the Prime Minister, because some of us can remember John Banks and John Key in 2008 saying it's no longer acceptable or credible for Helen Clark to assert a facade of confidence in her Foreign Affairs Minister and fail to ask plain questions of him that she has a duty to the public to ask. That is a direct quote from John Key about Helen Clark and Winston Peters in 2008. So then it came to 2012 and it got to John Banks and his donations that he received knowingly. John Key said, it's not my responsibility to ask questions. If someone thinks John Banks isn't telling the truth, it's very simple remedy. Go to the police. It's not my job to do a forensic examination. That's not what he said about Helen Clark. He said Helen Clark must stand Mr Peters down as a minister. That is what I would do if I was Prime Minister. Well, Mr Key has failed to stand down a minister who knowingly received donations, who by the police own admission knows he received those donations and has brought local government and this place into disrepute. So this bill goes some way to fixing those problems in terms of donations. There's going to be a much more transparent process for the future. It aims to prevent the situation we have seen with John Banks. It aims to have the same requirements on candidates in local elections or polls for donations, their disclosure and the filing of electoral returns as those that are already in place for candidates in the parliamentary elections. There's also going to ensure that there's consistency between the Local Electoral Act 2001 and the Electoral Act of 1993. The provisions in the Electoral Act 1993 are stronger and they are clearer in terms of accountability required by a candidate in an election. So, Mr Speaker, we will support this bill, but it ought to be called the John Banks Bill because it relates to the government hastily trying to fix something that the Prime Minister said was not a problem, that John Banks has done nothing,
member.
but
Her
now
time
they
has
need a bill
expired.
to fix it up.
Mr Speaker.
I call Tim McIndoe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Not for the first time